Psychology of Climate Change. That's our last draft of the title. Climate change, or especially the subject that we're talking about here, really is not just climate change, because change is what climates do. It's about anthropogenic climate change, which is a much different matter, which is climate change that's caused by human activity. And in thinking about climate change, I've come to think of it in terms of three basic points. First of all, climate change is about, anthropogenic change is about human impacts on Earth ecosystems, very simply. In order to have that, something we don't pay as much attention to is that we need information that tells us that the climate has changed and that it's a result of human agency. And then there's a third thing we need in order to deal with anthropogenic climate change, is to understand the information and accept it and act upon it. We definitely have the evidence of increasing human impacts on Earth's ecosystem. We're also seeing a great acceleration of information and information systems that enable us to have a better information idea of the fact the climate is changing and that human agency is a cause, maybe not the entire cause. I don't think anybody would argue that, of the change. And the third part is the what I'd call the psychological processing. That is, human beings understanding and accepting the information and acting upon it. It's the third one that is at issue here. There is a tremendous failure. Failure isn't quite the word I want to use here, but there's a tremendous lack of evidence of reliable human acceptance and understanding and willingness to act upon what amounts really, in fact, to a tremendous body of information at this point about climate change. What is the reason for this disjunction between the information and the human acceptance of it? And what we're talking about essentially is not a climate issue alone. It's about human consciousness and human agency. Climate change in the world right now and a lot of the other processes that are taking place in the world are the result of human consciousness. And that doesn't necessarily have to be in itself accusatory. It's just saying this is the way the world is and these are the reasons it happens to be that way today. What we'll do in this session, sequence of events, is after a brief introduction from me. My name is Walt Anderson. My academic background is in political science and social psychology, both of which are relevant to this subject. I live in California. I grew up partly in Nevada. I'm going to introduce first Alberto Zucconi, who will speak for 15, 20, 25 minutes at the outside about essentially a psychological and therapeutically oriented understanding of human denial in relation to climate change. Secondly, I will put in a short semi-presentation of my own discussing a slightly different point of view, which is much more social than individual psychological. And thirdly, we will hear from Aftab Omer, who is hiding at the bottom of the table there, who will also talk about his own take on the social dimensions of climate change, of anthropogenic climate change. Um, I'll introduce each of them as they begin to make their presentations. So I'll say in the beginning that Alberto Zucconi, sitting on my left, is a clinical psychologist and a former student and collaborator of the late Carl Rogers, one of the founding fathers of humanistic and originator of the climate-centered therapy and the person-centered approach, a scientifically formulated paradigm that has impacted the fields of psychology, education, and management. He doesn't say anything about the fact that he also was a former student of mine for one course in San Francisco about 30 years ago, which made him what he is today. Dr. Zucconi is the president of the Person-Centered Education, of the Person-Centered Approach, is president of the Person-Centered Approach Institute, IACP, a nonprofit international organization co-founded with Carl Rogers and Charles Devonshire and dedicated to research in human behavior, the promotion of health, and the training of professionals. IACP is a World Health, WHO collaborating center for research, training, and consulting and health promotion in the workplace in Italy and the host institution, etc. And that's all you get, Alberto.
Thank you, Walt. That course changed the course of my life. Before I start, thank you really the Bibliotheca Alexandrina and Ismail Secardine for this invitation. This is a wonderful conference. I have learned a lot. And here in the few minutes I have, I would like to underline a basic principle common to all the living things. All the living things, humans, animals, plants, have a fundamental survival mechanism. Self-awareness generates self-regulation. If you are a sunflower, a frog, a human, and you are healthy, you develop your potentiality by having this basic fundamental mechanism. When this mechanism gets impaired, problem results. In psychotherapy, denial is a defense mechanism that is put into place when a human being cannot stand to face a reality because it generates too much anxiety, too much trouble. Well, this is done, but at a cost. It becomes unaware of the threat, and this can be actually with dire consequences. Denial is, in the literature, well known as a defense mechanism that we use as a way not to face reality. So it's a refusal to admit or recognize something, and typical is drug addicts that denial they have a problem. Alcoholics, compulsive spenders, and so, and so, and so. My colleagues would tell you about it's not only with drugs or habits that denial is unfortunately in place. So, as we said, denial is a protection. I am not aware of what I don't want to be aware. But this is very costly defense and is used in combination with other tricks. Anyhow, in the literature, denial is the most tough barrier that creates a problem for change, for recovery. And it takes a very many aspects. For example, in the literature, is one doesn't want to know about the dangers of smoking, what smoking tobacco can cost to me, or distorts the information, or minimize the significance of the consequences, or one negates totally and lies about the family and friend that he has a problem, or he has, censor even his memory, so he's actually speaking the truth, he thinks, because he's editing reality. Or he does wishful thinking. I remember dramatically, in my institute, we train a medical doctor and clinical psychologist for 4 years to become a psychotherapist. And I remember visiting the hospital, one of my postgraduate students, a medical doctor, and she was dying for breast cancer. And so I asked, I knew her for many years, I said, how couldn't you detect the fact that you had a very large tumor on your left breast? And she said, oh, I did, but I was so scared that I did everything not to face it. She's dead now. So people want to even to change topic when something they are touchy about. Anyhow, as I said with the starting of this, this is not a light matter, because this is about health and functioning and developing potentiality. This is so the self-awareness, self-regulation mechanism, indicating if an organism is healthy or impaired. But I'm not talking about defense mechanism as a bad thing per se. Every clinician knows that very well. It's actually adaptive. So let me make an example. If I defend immediately for a shock, like I lose my mother, a son, I go into immediate denial. But if I deny that after 6 years that the event occurred, that is pathology. If I stay in denial for a couple of months, that is normal defense mechanism. So denial is really a problem, is pathological when a chronic, like a defense. If I'm defending myself because I'm under attack, it's great. But if I stay in that position, frozen, that is called paranoia. And the reason is that I am frozen, and this limits and I'm rigidified, and so my capacity to react is very diminished. Echo, Sigmund, he said it all already, almost 100 years ago. Psychotic denial is people are angry, denying any evidence, or they are acting out, saying enemies, scapegoats that they can blame, and they have a reaction that are totally wasteful and destructive, or they project into something else that is far away, or they are able to negate totally, suppression. Carl Rogers, my hero and mentor, said similar things, that the individual or groups, when they go into denial, basically are incongruent, and so they reduce contact with oneself, and so doing with others and the whole world. And so also he was in agreement that we construe the experience of reality in denial through distortion, negation, or suppression. Anyhow, what happens when change creates a new threat. Individuals or community or even a whole culture can face the threat and experience fear. And remember, a courageous person or a courageous community is not somebody or a community that doesn't experience fear. Fear mobilizes energy to face the challenge. Face with the fight or flight reaction. That's healthy. But a more dysfunctional or constant way of coping is activated when instead of fear, we have unnamed fear, just anxiety. And we have fear, but we lost track of what we are afraid of. And so we don't see things clearly. We have cognitive dissonance, and instead of self-regulation because we are aware, we use denial, and we use our energy to do something else. We waste energy, but the threat remains untouched. So we need to, Ismail said in the opening, to put together our knowledge and use it with wisdom. We need, in my terms, to integrate our cognitive understanding, for example, of a threat, also with empathic understanding, to keep in contact, to be courageous and be in contact. With what? Because if I am in contact, I'm in contact and understand empathically, not just rationally myself. And that is the basic requirement to be in touch with others of different religions, color, belief system, and also in touch with the world. We live in a world that usually, for many people, is animated by things, by numbers, not by life. And people chop down forests because they are a commodity. They are not living, breathing, feeding organisms which we relate to. And so the empathic understanding, to be in contact with oneself, is the basic ingredient to be able to be in contact, real life-giving contact with the rest of life forms. And so the challenge, I guess, also for a clinical psychologist, is in this period of change, are we going to have a quantum jump in our evolutionary process in terms of self-awareness and self-regulation, or we just get flooded and carried away in our destructive learned helplessness? You know very well that a few years ago, Paul Cruzen, a Nobel Prize and a member of our academy, the World Academy of Art and Science, created the concept of Anthropocene. Like, let's get in contact that we are dealing the cards of this game. Mainly, we are the prime actors. Walter Truett Anderson says it much better than me, and so I just cite him in a book that he wrote, The Planet We Inhabit is undergoing a huge transition, and so is our knowledge about it. We are engaged, so self-awareness, in a learning process now, contemplating, or if we deny, avoiding to, a transition quite unlike anything that has happened in the course of human evolution. It has two parts: an acceleration of human impact on Earth life system, as Walter was saying in the introduction, and a corresponding increase in the reach and power of the information system that bring us news about the first. Most of us now have some information and option, however scantily form, about the impacts. Few of us have much idea where that information comes from. So a big part of our learning process will be getting acquainted with Earth's own bioelectronic information network. We will learn that it doesn't just bring information about the human modification of Earth, is in itself another big modification, one of the biggest of all time. I agree totally. And so the point for me is so simple and so difficult to face. We want to stay in contact and be courageous and face the challenges of our time, or we want to hide. Whatever it will, I wish you, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears just a little bit to this other dimension, the social dimension of specifically climate change denial. As probably some of you know, that comes in several forms, including in the United States and in some European countries, a political movement, in essence, a group of people who are strongly convinced that denial, or rather that the idea of anthropogenic climate change is a deliberate contrivance of environmentalist groups and other wrong thinkers, and who are, in the words of Rick Santorum, a recent presidential candidate in the United States, specifically for the purpose of being able to gain more control over the private lives of citizens, of having a rationale for telling them what they can and cannot do. But there's also another and kind of more subtle and I think more widespread and in a way insidious form of political denial, and that's what I want to talk about for just a minute. And I'm going to quote a bit from a book I bought recently, which I recommend anybody who wants to pursue the subject. It's entitled Living in Denial, subtitle Climate Change, Emotions, and Everyday Life. It was written by a young woman who teaches social psychology in the state of Washington, U.S. In the book is a description of their argument, which is going to sound a little bit strange, but I think that after a few minutes of discussion, you will get a handle on what the author is trying to say. She is speaking for a shift from an information deficit model in which the public fails to respond because of a lack of information to a social, quote, social organization of denial model in which the public actually resists putting available information on the subject of climate change. That probably means, from what I just read, very nearly nothing, but let me try to translate. Really saying that the problem with a lot of the people in the world, particularly in the United States, who sort of know about human-caused climate change and sort of don't, and manage to refuse it in essentially the same way that patients in psychotherapy that Alberto presented. And the fundamental process is simply that they find the prospect of the world's climate changing in destructive ways, in processes that are caused by human beings, to be literally unbearable. It is so discomforting that they simply do what people do with things that they can't handle, which is get them out of their foreground consciousness. They argue them away with themselves in some sense or another. Let me get into The reason I wanted to bring this book was to get to a few quotations from people she interviewed. She spent some time on a research program in Norway and discovered that the people she met there, and she lived in a medium-sized city whose name she doesn't mention, but a city, as I recall, about 14,000 people, something in that range, described their life, which sounded very attractive. They spend a lot of time skiing. They grow up in the same community, fairly close, a lot of relatives in the community. They're very involved in community activities. They love hiking and they love skiing, and they live their whole lives there. It's a very almost idyllic sounding place in some ways, but she talks about the fact that they don't talk at all, or scarcely at all, about the existence of climate change, even though they will on occasion mention it, you know. Why isn't there as much snow as there used to be? How has the climate kind of changed? And yet they don't take that next step to speculating about why that might have happened. They just kind of look at it and move away from it. And that looking at it and moving away from it is a very successful, in a sense, operation for their particular need, which is a need for all of us to live comfortably and to live in a way we're familiar with. They cannot really look at the possibility of a change so deep that they would have to fundamentally change many of the things in the way they live. It happens that the people in this town are also, like many people in Norway, which has a great reputation as a very environmentally responsible country. Have certain things in their lives that doesn't seem congruent with their image of themselves and their public image to the rest of the world as a sort of simple living community of people who are very environmentally responsible. Yet it happens that Norway is, after Saudi America, excuse me, let me start all over there, that Norway, after Saudi Arabia, is the second largest oil exporter in the world. That causes a certain amount of difficulty in being able to mention to the world that you are the country of, you know, great environmental responsibility, or the country that Gro Harlem came from. I want to move to a couple of quotations. Here's a guy saying about his practices of how big his car is, how much he drives, and so forth. And he says, yes, there are many things we should have done differently, but we did it like the others did anyway, right? Because you have to fit into normal society. It is difficult. You can't just judge yourself out, right? If you did everything entirely ideal, you would be an outsider in the society, and then you wouldn't get anything done either. Now, I think that's a wonderful piece of denial operation. There's another one I thought was kind of interesting, because she's talking about their participation in the local community politics, and they have a great deal of very healthy political participation in their town meetings and their city council and so forth. But she mentions, and she's talking about the time that she was doing her research there, she said, what went on in these meetings in 2000 to 2001? Was climate change discussed? Meetings focused on a wide variety of topics, from zoning laws regarding downtown to new area for huts and, of course, the budget. To my surprise, climate change was never discussed in any of the city council or specific Labor Party strategy meetings I attended, or even in the meetings of the municipal subgroup on culture and environment. If people actually cared about the issue, how could this be? It seemed that from the perspective of both the newspapers and the local politicians, climate change was not a local issue at the time. When I asked Osteen, a member of the Labor Party who sat on the city council and was the father of several preteen children, about climate change, he responded, quote, "Yes, it is, of course, a theme that everyone is concerned in, but locally is not," excuse me, I got a wrong page here. But locally, it isn't just discussed much because, well, climate change, you know, there isn't much you can do with it on a local level. But of course, everyone sees that something must be done in order for, you know, to stop the development of climate. She says that in their review of denial with respect to environmental problems, they tend to describe the displacement of responsibility onto, quote, higher authorities or legitimate, thank you, decision makers as a form of denial or self-involvement. So you have a very cozy country, and they sound like genuinely nice people, but they are at the same time, as many people in the world are, whether it's somebody with a drinking or smoking or narcotics problem, or somebody in a family where there is incestuous molestation of a child going on, suffer from it and look away from it at the same time. And the whole family kind of suspects it and looks away from it at the same time. And haven't we all done that? I mean, it's a very human mechanism for making our lives a little bit more comfortable, but it has a cost, and the cost is looking away from things that really need your attention and deserve your attention. And I sometimes wonder, just parenthetically, if creatures other than human beings, other than symbolic animals, as some call us, are ever capable of denial. I really don't know. It's just something that I think about from time to time. I kind of suspect not. One thing one more quotation, and then I'll quit my little interim. And this, by the way, is the same information came from other sources as well. She said that what is particular is how respondents who are better informed about climate change express less rather than more responsibility for the problem. And they also found that, quote, in sharp contrast with the knowledge deficit hypothesis, respondents with higher levels of information about global climate change seem less concerned. The picture that she draws, and comes from some other research as well, is that people. Well, let me cite a study from some social scientists who went to Switzerland and took some surveys with people in that community about their opinions concerning climate change. And they had a very high level of response that they were very concerned about it, deeply worried about it. And then they did a survey with the same people about what they were doing personally in relation to their concerns. And they found a very high level of response that they really weren't doing much of anything because there really wasn't much of anything they felt they can do. And they had a tinge of conscience there, But they did the basic thing that we all tend to do, maybe not all of us, but that we certainly have a strong, I'd say generalized tendency to do, which is to make ourselves comfortable, to say that we are concerned about this, but we don't know quite what to do about it. We're overwhelmed by it, and we kind of retreat into a state of not quite discomfort, but not quite suffering either, or at least not acknowledged suffering. What would you call that in psychology? Denied?
Wishy-washy.
Wishy-washy. It's so nice to learn these technical terms. So that's all I'm going to say on this, but I will now turn over to my not-so-old friend, Aftab Omer, who will talk about his perspectives on this. Aftab is president of Meridian University in the San Francisco Bay Area. His research, he says, focuses on the collective and policy dimensions of some word that I can't read, formative learning in human systems. Formative learning in human systems.
Transformative learning.
Formative learning in human systems.
Transform.
Okay, yes, okay, I got it. He is a fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science and the International Futures Foreman. He studied at MIT, but apparently didn't like that too much, and moved to Brandeis, where he took a PhD in the sociology of education. Aftab.
Thank you, Walt. I might have titled this, Can Information About Climate Change Inspire and Motivate Collective Effective Action? We could also substitute climate change with something else. For example, cigarette smoking, or genocide, or we could say, can information about conditions in Syria right now inspire and motivate collective action? So the dilemma that information only sometimes leads to collective action is before us. I'd like to shift just for a moment from Norway to Nasruddin, specifically Mullah Nasruddin. Can I see your hand if you know who Mullah Nasruddin is? So more people know about Mullah Nasruddin in California than Egypt, apparently. So Mullah Nasruddin, a little story about him. He's a character, and you'll see why. Mullah Nasruddin's neighbor approaches him and says, "Can you guess what's in my hand?" And Nasruddin, being clever, says, "Well, give me a hint, give me a clue." And so the neighbor says, "Well, what I have in my hand is shaped like an egg, and it smells like an egg. It is white on the outside and yellow on the inside." And Nasruddin says, "Well, that's easy. It's a cake." And the neighbor says, "What I have in my hand comes from a hen." And Nasruddin says, "Like I said, it's a cake." So something, this is funny because some very core human frailty lives here, which brings us to the question at hand. What can make information influence action on a large scale? We know that's a challenge before us, and that the further information about whatever issue, our issue today is climate change, will not necessarily bring about the change. And so we know that there is some kind of barrier, some kind of wall between information and action. And we need to understand what this wall is. What is this barrier? What is this resistance? If we ask cigarette smokers, and the research has consistently shown this, do you know about the link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer? They will say a decisive yes. And of course, the labeling of cigarettes in Europe is at a whole other level than the US. Nevertheless, there's more cigarette smoking in Europe. So we know that whatever the type of learning that lets information move into action, that learning will have to bring down this wall in some way. And what is this wall made of? One answer that condenses many different aspects is to imagine the wall as a wall of identity. And here the term identity is holding different dimensions like belief systems about ourselves, deep assumptions about the communities, the organizations, the nations we're a part of. And that these core beliefs and deep assumptions give us our individual identity and give us our collective identity. And somehow, identity itself becomes a barrier to action. So I know that cigarettes cause lung cancer, but somehow my image of myself as a smoker and what it means to be a person who smokes, somehow just that becomes a barrier to my taking the action of stopping to smoke. So one would say that if Norway is producing and selling so much oil and that Norway's economy is so tied into the production and sale of oil, then at whatever level that is known and is a part of being Norwegian, that will become a barrier to action. Now, the Norway case represents an interesting example because, as Walt described, Norwegians in their daily functioning take many actions that are ecologically minded. So one could say that even good habits can become, in some ways, part of the wall that is a barrier to the depth of collective action that is called for by the threat itself. Okay, so the question then becomes, the methodological question at a large scale becomes, how does this wall between information and action be turned into a bridge, something, what will take people from information to action? And here, if I began to say fire, fire, there's a fire at the conference center, that information would lead us to respond. We would take action. We would leave this theater, and so on. Right? So we know that, let's say we were near a swimming pool, a lake, and we see a child drowning. There is immediate response and immediate action. There's the information, there's the action. you arrive at the scene of a car accident. And something in you responds immediately to help, certainly most people. So again, we see these are examples of where information clearly leads to action. So that's a clue. Now, you're Nasruddin right now, and I'm giving you a clue to what makes up this bridge between information and action. And so here's another clue, and it's a request. Would you turn around and say hello to somebody sitting near you who you don't know? That's my request to you right now. Okay, well done.
No, say hello to somebody you don't know. Hello.
So, in the context of a lecture, in the context of this auditorium, even that little bit of action evokes emotion. But once that emotion has been evoked, after that initial discomfort, I imagine you could have then kept engaged in some conversation, and as they say, the ice would have been broken. So this is an example of a bridge between information and action. Even a little bit of emotion somehow creates a bridge between what we know informationally and what we can do. However, as you can see from the examples I've given, that emotion itself is not a sustainable way for long-term collaboration where the context includes multi-stakeholders and where there are deeply conflicting interests. The West wants that India and China stop building coal-powered power plants. Will that happen? Doesn't look like it right now. So high stakes, long-term, multiple stakeholder collaboration requires something more than emotion and a learning process. You'll remember the quotation Alberto cited from Walt's writing. The learning process that is called for, while emotion is a bridge, but not sufficient. Because emotion will get us out of this auditorium if there's a fire or if there's news of a fire, but not bring about the large-scale shift we're looking for. This means that we need to recognize that information is one kind of knowledge and that there is another kind of knowledge that is key to action, especially collective action. So the first four kinds of knowledge are associated with information. Skills is somewhat in the gray zone. The rest of my talk will be about the fifth kind of knowledge, Most education concerns itself with information, and of course it's important. And we see that the link between education, between formal education, higher education, and employment, even that link between what happens at colleges and universities, and then the competency demands, the competency requirements of employment. Even that competency gap that is being spoken of more and more demonstrates the inadequacy of education that is limited to information and does not have the fifth kind of knowledge on the earlier slide. This slide is conveying by showing capacities as a kind of knowledge that is the base for carrying information. One way to speak about it would be that there's a difference between knowing how to make a sword and how to use a sword on the one hand, and on the other hand, being a person who can be trusted with a sword, who can be trusted with power, including the power of knowledge. And so, if information is to be actionable, there is the role of this particular kind of competency that is being termed here capacities. What is the relationship between capacities and the very large amounts of information that we're needing to absorb? That something has to happen which will let our informational learning become actionable. So let me give you an example, a historical example. During the British colonial period in India, the British disallowed the use of salt. Not the use of salt, excuse me, disallowed the making of salt. And this went on for many years, and at one point during the independence movement, Gandhi proposed a particular action, which was to have almost a 200-mile walk to the beach, to the coast of India, as a procession, and then to go to the beach and make salt. And so he did that. And in that process, there was a lot of attention, the fact that that was the intention. This was quite puzzling to the British. And it created however, the information that the British were actually putting a tax on salt began to spread by the transgression of the law. And you might say that the information about the salt tax now had emotion attached to it. And in that way, it mobilized the independence movement to a whole other level, and it has come to be known as the Salt March. This is an example of being able to turn information into collective capacity. And so the idea here is that emotion itself, while it is a bridge from information to action, but in itself cannot be sustained unless there is this deep infrastructure of capacity, individual capacity and collective capacity. So the main distinction I'm hoping to convey here is between the kind of learning that we spend almost all of our time doing, informational learning, and this other kind of learning, which can be termed transformative learning, which builds capacity. And it builds capacity based on emotion and the whole range of bodily experience that enables emotion. I think I will pause here.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Just my name.
Salah Suleiman is a very unselfish man who said I don't have to introduce him, but nevertheless,
Most of the people knows me.
he was on a panel with me 2 years ago here about a more conventional panel about climate change, and very pleased to see him again. I should just mention, by the way, that as far as I know, this is the first time the Library of Alexandria has had a panel on psychological issues, and they were very happy to take this on, but we're exploring some new territory here.
Thank you, Walter. And this is what makes me trapped between most of the eminent three speakers here about the psychology, and they are very famous psychologists, of course, and I'm just a chemist. But anyway, before I start, let me just salute the soul of my dear professor, Dr. Abdel Fattah Al-Qassas, who passed away about a month ago. And he well known for all of his knowledge and disseminating knowledge about biodiversity.
Could you speak
also-
a little louder, please? Could you speak a little
yeah,
louder?
Sure.
That's for me, mainly.
Okay. I said that I just want to salute the soul of my dear professor, Mohammed Abdel Fattah Al-Qassas, who well known around the world by his work, sincere work, in the area of biodiversity. Also, I wish good health to my dear professor, Mustafa Tulba, who well known for his work in the environments, being the head of the United Nations Environmental Program for nearly 2 decades. He is in the hospital at the moment, and I wish that he has a good health. My presentation is something, in the beginning, was a little bit different from the core of this session, but understanding what has been said by my previous speakers, let me just add a couple of points, and then I go back to my presentation. Who are denying climate change? Well, not scientists who provide the information and produce the facts. Not the public who are affected by these changes. Only politicians are the ones who are denying the climate change under which and its impact we are living right now, and our becoming generation will face very soon. They are moving from just the very simple response of deny to the paranoia stage, as Alberto just said, those politicians. The public never deny, respond, and I will assure you that some people here in Egypt respond very much to the climate change without even knowing the cause of the effect they were facing, and they changed their behavior since the beginning of the 19th century, the 20th century, in the year 1910, as you will be seeing from a couple of short movie I'm going to show to you. We live in an era of 3 profound changes on the global scales: land use, climate change, loss of biodiversity. And all of these are working together, affecting our life on this planet. This, what I really prefer to call the global fire triangle: land use change, climate change, and biodiversity change. And they are, all are connected together. Change here lead to change there, and change there, back again, affect the other parties, sides of the triangle. We've been going during the last many thousands years from the overuse and the great use of our natural resources, ending us in where we are right at the moment. I'm going through very quickly in my slides, and all of the information here I think you have seen sometimes in maybe many other lectures about climate change. But these are what we call the curves, the well-known curves to all of us. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere in which we live. Temperature curve. Atmospheric methane concentration. Nitrogen flux to our ocean, lakes, and other water bodies. Tropical rainforest and woodland loss, same. Species extinction, talking about biodiversity here, also the same. So it's a great acceleration in this curve occurred particularly starting from 1950 until now. What do we need to do during the upcoming 10 years is to bend this curve. Otherwise, we will face, the human race will face reality of dangerous things on this earth. We call this the planetary boundaries. And as you see it here, and the change in it was mainly caused by our activities as human beings. This is the case before pre-industrial we were that spot inside the boundary which we should not exceed during the pre-industrial time. Look what happened in the 50s to this. We are here with regard to agricultural land use, with regard to nitrogen flux, and with regard to climate change, as well as the freshwater consumption. See the 70s to the 80s, how this is exceeding the boundary. 90 to 2000. How much we do? And now, where we are heading to. This is the main problem. But our politicians still deny this. The United States Environmental Protection Agency has just started to talk about climate change just a few years ago. Yes. Speculated and other identified causes of climate change prior to the industrial era, before 1780, change in the Earth's orbit did cause some climate change in the history of our universe, in our planet as well. Change in the sun intensity, volcano eruption, all of those could be source of climate change. But they are not happening now. They did before. Man is doing what we have right now, right at the moment. Volcano can emit, all volcanoes around the world occurred on the planet, can emit only 1/100 of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere as our human activity did right now. So, as I mentioned, we emit some nearly 36 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Should we punish the things or punish the user of that things? If we are talking about coal, oil, cars, whatever. It's the use, not the things, which we should refer to. Let me just give you some example of what we have here in Egypt. And I thank Dr. Khalid Ouda for allowing me to use part of his slides, as well as a Stockholm Resilience Center for using some of their slides also in my slide here, in my presentation here. This is a case in the delta of the Nile. Many of my students, some of them are presented here, visited this area, and we see for ourselves, and seeing is believing what is happening there. And our farmers, they noticed that before. They noticed the consequences, not the cause, and they act accordingly by changing their agricultural habits. They move from cultivating vegetable to field crop, to rice, to fish, and then some of them left their lands. This is what's happening in the delta of the Nile. And there are some other two deltas around the world, in Vietnam and in Bangladesh, who are suffering the most. This is if the sea level rise go up by 100, we are losing all the yellow part of our delta. If it's 2 meters, and they are talking about 2 meters right now, this much will be lost from our delta. I will end up with 2 captions here, one from the BBC, which broadcasted a couple of years ago. Would like you to see how our farmers respond to climate change. Their behavior and agricultural practices changed accordingly. But this is what was broadcasted also about 2 years ago by the National Public Radio, nearly 200 stations in the United States, and they have a very nice and well-known program called Sunday Edition. And they came to us here, and I took them along with my student to visit places near Rosetta.
It is believed that some 8,000 years ago, Egypt's desert, the Sahara, began changing due to a shifting climate. It used to be grassland. The drier climate meant Egyptians gravitated towards the great Nile River and eventually began farming. The Greek philosopher Herodotus said Egypt is a gift of the Nile, and that is still true today. 95% of Egyptians live along the Nile River, and once again, their way of life is threatened by a changing climate, this time due to global warming. The World Bank says Egypt faces potentially catastrophic consequences. One problem is that the rising seas are pushing salty water from the Mediterranean upstream into the Nile Delta. The salt is contaminating the fresh groundwater that farmers use for irrigation. This is the Mazra'at, or farm, of Sayyid Abdul Salam Tutu, sitting here with his 4-year-old grandson, Abdullah. They live outside Rosetta on the Nile Delta. This fruit and vegetable farm has been in their family for generations. Sayyid Tutu, the patriarch of the family, says they've had salt in their soil since the 1930s, but in the last couple of years, the problem has gotten worse. Notice the heaps of sand that bury the trunks of his date trees.
They have added pure sand over the salty soil in order to try to grow harvest out of it, especially vegetables. It affects vegetables and dates negatively.
This is Khamisa.
I'm his daughter and my mom is dead. And I'm here for my father. If you touch the sand yourself, you can actually feel the soul. It's coarse, you can feel the soul in it, and they need to add sand, but they can't afford it.
It's very expensive, Khamisa says, and we have to either harvest or eat, and we have to eat. Walking along the Corniche, or the ancient wall in Alexandria, you see waves crashing against hundreds of concrete barriers. The government is spending millions to protect the beaches from the rising sea. Scientists predict that the Mediterranean Sea will rise between 1 foot to up to 3 feet by the end of this century, flooding many of the towns and urban areas in the north of the Nile Delta. We are now in Rosetta, home of the famous Rosetta Stone. It is located in the mouth of the Nile and shows signs of beach erosion. Young Egyptian environmentalists like 16-year-old Imad William hope they can bring about an awareness urgently. Imad says because of global warming, Egyptians may be experiencing warmer weather than they are used to. He's written a PowerPoint project on climate change for his 9th grade class. 20-year-old Karim Suleiman says they'll continue to speak out until Egyptians take notice. And along with their teachers and mentors, they insist that adaptation has to begin now. Karim says although Egypt only contributes 0.5% of the global emission of carbon dioxide, much less than other developing countries such as the United States, his civilization could be greatly affected by climate change.
All right, this is all what I can say, but as you can see, our farmers change their practices without even knowing the cause of those practices. As I mentioned, they have to add new soil on the top of the soil, which is ruined by the salt coming by intruding the intrusion of the salt water underneath the soil. I thank you for your kind attention.
Well, we have about 10 minutes for a few questions, comments. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Farouk. I am working at the Egyptian Environmental Affairs Agency. And I would like to thank the panelists for the marvelous information that we have today. And I have a question regarding to the denial of the pollution that you mentioned right now. How could we switch this denial into action? Thank you.
I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I know of no serious activity to move on this kind of a concern. I think that if these interpretations are correct, and I think they are, I think the human species is sleepwalking into tragedy for the world. The one thing that I've been thinking about as a possible approach to it would be to do some articles or lectures and meetings with people, not just lectures and meetings, but workshops with interpersonal relations involved, which focus on not so much the mechanics of climate change, but on what we've just been talking about for the last hour and a half or so, which is the mechanics of the ways that people are responding to it. Because to get people to turn around and realize that that kind of psychological response is widespread, and see how people would respond to that. I have found in other kinds of contexts that when people get the handle on the concept and own it, you might say, the conversations then get very animated, and it brings about some change in people's understanding of the situation. That's the one thing that I can think of within the realm of the kinds of activities I'm familiar with that might make a difference.
Can I address to that?
I don't see why not.
We have a lot of research how to deal effectively or less effective with denial, for example, in the field of behavior change for drug addiction, smoke, tobacco addiction, obesity, and so forth. We know that, for example, simply making an informative campaign, cognitive training, amounts for only 10% of success, and 90% would be unsuccessful, so they attempt. We know that much more successful, about 30%, is if we train people uniting the cognitive with the emotional. But if we focalize on individual, the maximum we can obtain, if everything goes well, is 30% success. So it means 70% unsuccessful. What we know, it works the best between 65 and 85% success is to promote change in the people's lives through changing the environment that is conducive. So the school environment, the family environment, the working environment that is conducive to that change. So, for example, if it's a good eating, is to make good food available in school, in a restaurant, all that. If we go, in this, we would say, as my former professor, Walter Anders, explained very well in his books, becoming aware that we need the proper tools to promote change, and change is an action of social construction of reality, because reality is construed socially. And so if we don't have the media, religious leaders, all the stakeholders join together and think globally, but actually locally, as the World Health Organization slogan says for the last 30 years on health promotion, we're not going to get somewhere. But our friend here was underlined, who's mostly denying the thing? The people that mostly could do a great help, politician. But the politician, if he's a democracy, they are elected officer. So until the people wouldn't demand loudly that these are issues that are addressed, I don't think we're going to see much change.
Thank you. I wish we had more time, but thanks all of you, all of our panelists, including Aftab, still hiding back there in the corner. Thanks very much. I appreciate your coming.
Thank you, our chair.